All right. So, picking up where we left off, we would last talked about James K. Polk and his expansionist agenda and how he became president and immediately had annexed Texas in 1845. But Polk is not going to stop there when it comes to westward expansion. This is really the hallmark of his presidential campaign and of his presidency. And to understand who James K. Polk was, as I mentioned, he's a Democrat that is largely labeled as pro-slavery and anti-Native American. In fact, John Quincy Adams, an earlier statesman from the United States, a president of the United States, had described James K. Polk as a slave-holding exterminator of Indians. And that was really all he had to say about him. And so, Polk is really obviously one of the things that he's trying to do as part of this push to continue expanding America is get any other obstacles out of the way. And so in 1846, he is now eyeing a possibility of war with Mexico, an issue that we'll be dealing with immediately after this. But what Polk wants to do is there's still this disputed boundary up in the Pacific Northwest and what we've been talking about as Oregon Territory. Oregon Territory was a jointly held possession between the British and the United States. They had disputed where their boundary lines started and ended. And so he wants to make sure this issue is settled before he ends up going to war with Mexico, something that, as we'll see, he views this as an absolute inevitability. And so Polk is going to, in 1846, take advantage of the fact that American settlers have been steadily pouring in over the last 3 decades, flooding into Oregon Territory. And Americans in this region have now drastically come to outnumber British subjects in the region. So, with this war on the horizon, the United States is going to send emissaries to England. They're going to send an envoy there to start discussing the cession of Oregon Territory. And what he's able to do is figure out the now extant boundary lines of what is Canada and the United States. And so he's going to be able to do this peacefully. He doesn't have to go to war. But what he's going to do is basically say to England, you can have the area north of this boundary line, we will get the area south. And so the cession of Oregon country or Oregon Territory in 1846, in a lot of ways, it's just Polk trying to get sort of an easy issue of westward expansion out of the way before he deals with a much more contentious issue, which is how America is going to seize the American Southwest. And so he gets the British to agree to the boundary lines. And when you look at a modern day map of the United States, the line that Polk is able to work out with the British is the present boundary in the Pacific Northwest between California, Oregon, Washington State, that whole region, and what is now Canada. And so he's able to wrap this up pretty quickly, and that boundary line exists right up until today. And if you're, again, following along with me in the slideshow, you'll see on slide 22 we have a map that shows the area that the United States is going to be able to grab up as part of the cession of Oregon country or Oregon territory. And you can also see that line up there that sort of separates the United States from Canada. So that brings us to the much bigger issue moving through our slideshow, the Mexican-American War. This is a conflict that will rage on between 1846 and 1848. And essentially, it's motivated by these unclear boundary lines in the South. When Texas gains its independence, the United States and Mexico are disputing where the United States and Texas begins and ends, and Mexico begins and ends. And so they are vague, unclear boundary lines, and Polk wants to try to settle this. What he does is he sends an ambassador down to Mexico, a guy by the name of John Slidell. And Slidell is going down there ostensibly to deal with these boundary disputes and to collect some unpaid debts that Mexico owes to the United States. Slidell goes down and he's given the instructions from Polk. These negotiations are never supposed to actually yield a fruitful solution for both sides. They're not really negotiations. Slidell goes down with an incredibly aggressive stance to Mexico, and he says, look, here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept our boundary lines for Texas, and that's just that. You're going to pay us the outstanding debts that you owe us. We're finished with that issue. In addition, you're also going to give us New Mexico and Southern California. Now, he knows, Polk knows this. Slidell knows this. Mexico's not giving up any more land. They're still very, very angry about Texas, the Texas Revolution, and Texas independence. They don't want to give up any more land in that territory. So, understandably, those negotiations are going to fail. There's really nothing positive that's going to be able to come out of that with the stance that Slidell takes. With their boundary lines unsettled, with the debts unpaid, Mexico and America go to war in 1846. And this is something that Polk really wanted. Polk knew that Mexico is kind of in disarray. Their early government has not really been able to get a solid footing. They've had military dictatorships since Santa Anna came in. And also, they're fighting a number of rebellions in their own country, so they can't devote a lot of resources to fighting the United States. And this is ultimately why Polk is so eager to go to war. He sees this as an easy victory and an easy way to pick up land in the American Southwest. When we look at how America responds to this declaration of war, they split pretty much along regional lines, and it again ties back into slavery. Southerners strongly support the war with Mexico. They're going to be in favor of this, and Northerners are saying basically, to continue to fight with Mexico down in the South, we're basically just fighting to try to expand slave territory out to the coast. And so that is really the way that the nation isn't fully in support of this war, but Congress will vote in favor of going to war with Mexico, and there will be 2 years of fighting. And the fighting is largely kind of tit-for-tat skirmishes, right along the borders of New Mexico, modern-day New Mexico and Mexico, out in the Pacific Ocean. There's a lot of naval warfare going on here. And the Americans have a clear advantage in naval warfare because Mexico is yet to develop a very powerful or efficient navy. And so, after 2 years of really kind of standstill fighting, not a lot of territory has been gained or lost on either side, the United States will launch an amphibious assault into Veracruz. Now, they will lose this battle in Veracruz. They fail to take the city. But what they do is they land enough soldiers there to basically skirt Veracruz, move around it. And when they move around Veracruz, they start marching directly towards the capital of Mexico, Mexico City. And when they get to Mexico City, they are able to capture the capital. With this being the case, Mexico realizes this is a lost fight. They cannot keep up this war with America. They don't even have their capital under their possession anymore. And so the victory here in Mexico City is going to force the Mexican government to accept the conditions of American victory, and they are going to sign something known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that's happening in 1848. This treaty is critically important. It ends the Mexican-American War, it recognizes the American victory, but it also is going to cede New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Southern California, as well as an extended part of Texas. Texas gets a little bit bigger as a result of this war, and it gives that all right over to the United States. And so this will allow the United States to continue that push towards westward expansion, keep moving towards the coast. And so really what we're looking at is now the whole of what we call the continental United States today is owned politically by the U.S. on paper. It's theirs. And so that is really going to allow for a more rapid development and expansion, really moving more populations into these areas in the latter half of the 19th century. So if you're following along with me in the slideshow on slide 26, you can see a copy of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ceding that territory over to the United States. And when we look on slide 27, that's showing you in the orange section there where it says 1848, that's showing you that all of the territory that Mexico is being forced to give up to the U.S. And so Texas now, as you can see, doesn't look exactly like where we're living today. They're a little bit bigger back at this time, everything they call Texas territory. And the Mexican Cession area, what's being given over to the United States, that is the orange section that you're seeing on that map. So again, another huge part of what today we call the U.S. is given to the U.S. by Mexico after the Mexican-American War. So we have most of the country now under American control, and that issue of slavery pops up once again. The Whig Party had already split over the issue of expanding slavery westward. They're falling apart. They're crumbling. The Democratic Party is starting to fall apart as well. You still have Northern Democrats who are anti-slavery and Southern Democrats who are pro-slavery. Now, these schisms are ultimately going to start to create room for what are known as free soil parties. In 1848, we start to see them emerge. They are all in favor of complete and total abolition of slavery in the United States. These are really the precursors of our modern day Republican Party. As I've mentioned in class prior to this, the origins of the Republican Party rest in a push to end slavery in the United States. But now we have all this new territory, and Americans have to come to some sort of consensus on how slavery is going to operate there, if it will operate at all. And a Pennsylvanian congressman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania by the name of David Wilmot, will introduce what we call the Wilmot Proviso in 1848. This bill stated that slavery could not expand into those recently acquired territories that were picked up after the Mexican-American War. In other words, what's happening here is whatever Mexico ceded to the U.S. as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is off limits for slavery. Now, this is ultimately going to be seen as an attack by the Southerners. They see this as an attack on their peculiar institution. And so there is a lot of anger over the Wilmot Proviso. It's going to squeak through in Congress, but ultimately there's going to be a lot of opposition to this. The president, James K. Polk, steps up and says, I don't think the Wilmot Proviso is fair. Really, what we should do is just continue extending that line of the Missouri Compromise that was established in the 1820s. It's an imaginary line that splits the United States in half, and it says anything south of the line is slave territory, anything north is free territory. So Polk says, let's just take that line all the way out to the Pacific coast and let it deal, and we'll have it that way. This doesn't work for Northerners because now all that territory that was just acquired from Mexico has become open to slavery. So that is when a senator from Michigan, Lewis Cass, will introduce the idea of popular sovereignty. And this will become the mechanism by which people decide on slavery moving forward. The idea of popular sovereignty says settlers should move into the territory and then vote whether or not they want slavery. It's a really simple concept. It's kind of democracy in action. But there is an issue here. Cass doesn't specify when you vote for slavery. He doesn't say it's as soon as you have X number of settlers. He doesn't say it's once you've drafted a state constitution. So there's no clarity on when this vote is supposed to take place. Now, as far as the Southerners are concerned, they think it should be when you've drafted a state constitution, then the people in the territory vote on slavery. Northerners think it should occur once a state legislature is established, something that would be happening earlier. And you can see the thought processes here. What the South wants to do is flood a bunch of people and their slaves in, give them time to settle in the territory, and then you're taking slavery away from people. You're not just saying it's illegal in the first place. Those are two very different things you're trying to do. And so Northerners want to vote earlier because they want to stop slavery before it enters into these territories. Now, this becomes really one of the most contentious issues. Now slavery and westward expansion is firmly the hot button issue of the mid-19th century in America. All of this issue over slavery is going to allow Zachary Taylor, a Mexican-American war hero, to become the final Whig president in the United States. And he's running for president in 1848. Largely what he's going to do is he's going to say, we need unity over partisanship. I'm not here to try and negotiate the issue of slavery. I am trying to lead the country forward one way or the other. And he basically runs a sort of two-faced campaign, something we're kind of a lot more familiar with in modern times. He's one of the first presidential candidates to run two different campaigns. When he goes down in the South, he says, look, I'm a slave owner. You know what I'm going to do. You know who I'm going to look out for. But then when he goes and he campaigns up north, he says, look, I'm not going to use my veto power to get rid of legitimate laws that were passed by Congress, laws like the Wilmot Proviso. So he's basically convincing the South, yes, I'm going to expand slavery westward, and he's convincing the North, I'm not going to get involved. I have nothing to do with slavery. I'm just the president. I execute the laws. I don't make the laws. And so because of this, he has a very smooth run into the White House and will become the next president. Martin Van Buren, who is really becoming a prominent figure of the Abolitionist Party, he is going to really hurt the Democrats. He's going to draw a lot of anti-slavery Democrats away from that party by running as a free soil candidate. Now, as we know, he's not going to win, but they are trying to eliminate slavery from every inch of American soil, and this is going to badly hurt the Democrats' chances of actually winning the election. So that's what's kind of catapulting Taylor into the White House. So that wraps up our discussion on actual territorial gains, how America comes to acquire all this area on paper. The last issue I want to deal with for this week's lectures is the California Gold Rush. And what we're looking at here is rapid expansion in the 1840s in the early 1850s. The gold rush really begins in earnest in 1848. But by the time this gold rush comes to an end, you have so many 49ers, as they call them. It's really the bulk of the gold rush. That name is suggesting something. There's a reason that the San Francisco 49ers are called the San Francisco 49ers. It's because the vast majority of migrants moving to California in search of gold are moving during the year 1849. You can see how creative that is. But the issue here is that so many people are going to move into California between 1848 and 1850 that by 1850, California is going to be able to apply for statehood, and they are going to enter into the Union as a free state at their own will. But to kind of look at the story of the gold rush, it begins in January of 1848. That's when a guy named John W. Marshall, who's living in Northern California, just outside of modern-day San Francisco, he discovers some gold nuggets in a stream on a property called Sutter's Mill. Marshall would then take his gold to a local shopkeeper in the big city of San Francisco. This shopkeeper then starts basically retooling his business. He starts putting mining goods in his store. He starts selling things you would need to find gold. Then he runs out into the streets with a big jar of gold dust and starts yelling, "There's gold everywhere, there's gold everywhere. Everyone needs to come to California and find gold." Pretty soon local newspapers start picking up on this, and the word starts to spread back east. And everyone now is under this belief that California is absolutely replete with gold. You can't swing an axe anywhere without hitting gold. And so, once news hits the East Coast, it spreads from there around the rest of the world. The vast majority of migrants that are going to start to put this gold rush into motion are coming from the eastern United States. They're coming from what today we call the Midwest and sort of the Northeast. And even the American Southeast. But you're also seeing people come from Australia, South Africa. You have people coming from mainland Europe, people coming from Latin America. Another massive migrant group that moves over to the United States during this time are the Chinese. So they're going to start migrating and moving by boat through the Pacific, coming into California. In fact, the name for California, and I can't remember whether it's Cantonese or Mandarin, one of the two dialects of Chinese, what you're looking at is that the name of California up until this day means mountain of gold in their language. It shows you how pervasive this idea is. Now, when gold is initially discovered in California, it is a sparsely populated area. There's very few people there. But by 1850, over 2 years, 50,000 people will move in, most of them coming from the eastern U.S., but really people from all over the globe start pouring into California. What that does is it allows it to apply for statehood in that same year, in 1850. And so you can see how rapid this expansion was in California. And people are moving out there. It's important to understand the mindset. A lot of people are going to move out there, look their whole lives, never find gold, and die poor. But the reality is that this is an opportunity that you can't find anywhere else. You can stay on your farm in the Midwest and work until you die, basically, and you'll just barely be able to make ends meet. With one swing of a pickaxe in California, you can be rich beyond your wildest dreams. And so this type of economic opportunity, this is what's pulling people in, but it's a big gamble. People are basically putting their lives on the line to try and move into California. As I mentioned, if you're following along with the slides, on slide 33, we have to start talking about all of the different types of people that are moving into California. They're coming from all over the globe, and there's a large number of Chinese migrants moving in. They're really the most notable, most visible migrant class coming from outside the United States during the gold rush. But you also have Spanish speakers who are living there since it belonged to Mexico, and even before that when it belonged to Spain. They initially are working with the Americans to start setting up a form of government. There's a lot of cohesion between the Spanish speakers and the English speaking Americans that move out there. But once the competition becomes fierce for gold in this territory, those Spanish speakers are dispossessed of their lands. They're basically being driven out of the way by the people pouring into California. Chinese migrants start to come in huge numbers, and they create a lot of resentment amongst the American gold prospectors. The Chinese are given the worst tracts of land, places where you think there's absolutely no gold, they're never going to make any money here. Somehow, they still manage to turn a profit. They're very, very successful in their mining endeavors. And so this creates that sort of economic tension between them and the American prospectors. And then all of a sudden, you start to see the creation of nativist laws. It bars Chinese migrants from working in the mining industry altogether. So they start to do other things. They open up restaurants. They open up hotels. They start engaging in other businesses. A lot of them will go and start building the railway and building out the railway system in that part of the nation. So they're going to be denied any claims to the areas where gold is actively being found, and they're constantly the target of American anger. Their mining camps are burned down. They're being violently attacked in the streets of San Francisco, and they're a very visible migrant group. They're very, very much, they have a lot of national pride, which makes, when they do communicate with Americans, they don't come off as necessarily happy to be in the United States or willing to adapt to American culture. They wear their hair differently. They wear their clothes differently. They speak, obviously, very different language. And so it makes them very visible targets, and there's a lot of hatred sent towards the Chinese during this time period. Then finally, you have Native Americans, and they're going to fare the worst out of any group out there. They are dying in huge numbers due to the rapid spread of disease. They're constantly in combat with American settlers. They're getting killed off in warfare. And all of this prospecting, grabbing up land, building new businesses, growing cities, it's pushing them out of the land that they needed to hunt and find resources. So they die from starvation as well. Today we refer to this as the California Genocide. But really, this is just the tail end of the California Genocide. This process actually begins back in the 1760s when Spain was still forcing Native Americans into missions and forcing them into these colonial enterprises where they were dying. But between 1848 and 1870, the population of Native Americans in California drops from 150,000 down to 30,000. So you can see that the vast majority of Native Americans are dying during this time period of the gold rush. So while it's a time of great prosperity for a lot of Americans, they've achieved finally this goal of manifest destiny. They've spread from coast to coast. Again, it's coming at the expense of the people who are already in those territories. So the gold rush is generally regarded as having ended in 1855, and we can still see some remnants of this in the American landscape. Mining is an incredibly boom-bust industry. Somebody finds gold, everybody pours into that one area, they dig, and when there's no gold left, everybody leaves. But what you're seeing is it's mostly men traveling out there looking for gold, but women would come out west to try their hand in trade as well. They would often work as domestic servants. They would work, a lot of times would get out there and find themselves making a good living with prostitution because you have a lot of single men out there looking for gold. But there are a lot of women who are actually great entrepreneurs, and they're able to get out there and start making huge fortunes for themselves. They're setting up hotels. They're setting up restaurants. These guys who are moving out, they need somewhere to stay. They need somewhere to eat. And women are taking care of these needs, these economic niches within the overall economic structure of California during the gold rush. And they're finding a lot more economic freedom than they might back east out here in the West. So Gambling and drinking become frequent problems out in the American West because there's a lot of desperation. As I said, everyone thinks that with one swing of the axe, I'm going to get rich. This is going to be it. But for a lot of people, it never happens. And so they spend whatever little money they do make drinking, gambling, and losing their money. In addition to this process, this is where we see the emergence of a number of ghost towns out in the West. And this is the remnant of the gold rush. You have everybody flooding into a little town, and all of a sudden there's a restaurant, there's 4 hotels, there's 3 more restaurants, there's now we need a sheriff and a sheriff's office. You see an entire economy builds around these gold mines, but then when the gold goes dry, they leave a ghost town behind. Everyone leaves, the buildings are still there, the structures are still there, but the people are not. And so the gold rush is going to largely deplete a lot of the mineral resources in California. Even though everyone was saying there's enough gold to go around forever in California, that's not really the case. They're going to go in, and that gold rush it basically clears Northern California of gold. And so by 1855, that whole process will come to an end. And as you go through the rest of the slides, you'll see some of the images of the different groups we've been talking about, sort of showing you these ghost towns, what mining life might have looked like. You can see some disturbing images from the California genocide. But to just wrap up this entire lecture for this week, I want you to take a look at the map on slide 38. When we look at where we started talking this week, you're seeing the Louisiana Purchase territory in that sort of pale tannish color in the middle. Down we see Texas annexation in yellow. And we see the Mexican cession in orange and the cession of Oregon country in green. And so when you look at all of that together, when you see everything that's going on there, you will realize that by the time the gold rush hits in the 1850s, America is looking at that concept of manifest destiny we talked about at the beginning of this lecture, and they're saying, mission accomplished. It's done. We have expanded from coast to coast. And as you can see from the map there, the modern day continental United States, with a few minor areas like the borders of Minnesota and sort of, I guess that would be North Dakota out there. That area, we're going to get that ceded by Great Britain. The Gadsden Purchase in 1853 adds a little bit on to the American Southwest. But for the most part, this area is now established. The United States as a continental entity has been completed. And manifest destiny to the people living during this time period looks like it has come to fruition. Well, I appreciate you tuning in for this week. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, feel free to shoot me an email at davyj@uhd.edu. And if you would like to speak face-to-face, kind of set up some remote office hours, face-to-face, we'll put in quotes, feel free to let me know and we can set up a Zoom session. So take care, everybody. I hope you're all doing well.